Amelia's life and legacy. So we'll start off with a quote from Amelia. So Amelia was 11 years old when she saw an airplane for the very first time at the Iowa State Fair in 1908. She was pretty unimpressed with this experience, and she later recalled this quote: "It was a thing of rusty wire and wood and looked not at all interesting." So pretty funny that that was her first impression of airplanes, and little did she know that these not at all interesting machines would someday become her life's passion. So who was this little girl who was so unimpressed with airplanes? We'll start off by looking briefly at Amelia's childhood here in Atchison. So Amelia was born in Atchison in 1897, and she was a pretty uncommon child for the time. She wasn't really concerned with what society expected of little girls. She was determined to kind of chart her own path and do what she wanted to do, regardless of what she was supposed to be doing. She was a natural leader, and she would lead her sister, her cousins, and other neighborhood friends on adventures all over town. So pictured here, we have Amelia and Muriel. The two of them would consistently tear their dresses when they were playing outside, and so their mom, Amy, decided to make them some more practical bloomers or pants, which you see them wearing in this picture. So another way that Amelia was kind of unusual for the time, wearing pants as a little girl. So a brief story that I want to share from Amelia's childhood is the story of when she built her own roller coaster. The Earhart family went to the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, and Amelia and Muriel saw a roller coaster there that they wanted to ride. But when they asked, they were told that roller coasters were just for boys. They were too dangerous for girls to ride on. So you can imagine this was pretty disappointing for the two girls. So when they got home, Amelia decided to take matters into her own hands and build her own roller coaster. And it looked pretty similar to this mock-up you see here that we're going to have in our museum. She propped wooden boards up against the shed, and she coated those boards with grease and slid down in a wooden crate. And as you can imagine, she crashed. But this is a really good early example of Amelia's very adventurous spirit, taking matters into her own hands. And after she slid down that roller coaster and crashed, she told her sister, "It's just like flying." So that desire to fly was in her pretty early on. So after her initial run-in with airplanes at the Iowa State Fair, Amelia became reacquainted with airplanes when she was serving as a volunteer nurse in Toronto during World War I. So she was volunteering at the Spadina Military Hospital, and there were a lot of pilots who were coming in and out of that area, flying their planes overhead, and she became pretty fascinated with them. And the rest, as they say, is history. So this next quote I have here is a pretty far cry from Amelia's first impression of airplanes. After she became a pilot, she said, "Ours is the commencement of a flying age, and I am happy to have popped into existence at a period so interesting." And Amelia went on to help define this flying age, and she was part of what made it so interesting in the end. So Amelia flew as a passenger in an airplane for the very first time in California at the end of 1920, in December of 1920. And in January of 1921, she took her first flight lesson. She wanted a female flight instructor to teach her how to fly, so she took lessons with another famous pilot named Netta Snook. If you have not heard of Netta Snook before, you should definitely look her up. We don't have time to get into her right now, but she is a fascinating figure in her own right. Amelia went about setting records almost right away. She set the women's altitude record of 14,000 feet in 1922. And in 1923, she became the 16th woman in the US to earn her pilot's license. Now in 1924, flying kind of took a backseat in her life. Her parents divorced in 1924, in part due to her father's alcoholism. So both divorce and alcoholism were pretty taboo topics at the time, and experiencing them in her family was a difficult thing for Amelia. And so when this happened, she actually moved from California to Massachusetts to help provide for her mom. So she began working as a teacher and later as a social worker. So she put her flying on the back burner for a while. She focused mainly on her work, and she was flying in her spare time, but it was not really her main focus at that time. So despite these challenges that she faced, Amelia persevered, and she ended up making her way back to flying when the time was right, which ended up being about 4 years later. So in 1928, Amelia was approached by a publisher by the name of George Putnam, who was helping coordinate a flight for the first woman to cross the Atlantic in an airplane. So Amelia agreed to take part in this, only to find out that she would be flying just as a passenger in the plane. She would not be a pilot, she would not be a co-pilot, she would just be sitting in the back. And she described this as being a sack of potatoes in the airplane because she just kind of sat there. So this was disappointing to her, but she still did the flight. She became the first woman to cross the Atlantic in an airplane. And even though she didn't pilot the plane, this turned her into a celebrity overnight. So with new income and fame as a result of this flight, Amelia set out to set her own aviation records, this time as a pilot in her own right. So I have listed here a number of flight records that Amelia ended up setting throughout her life. I'm not going to dwell too much on these because we all know that what Amelia is most famous for is being an accomplished pilot, and I want to focus on some of the other accomplishments she had in this presentation. One thing I will point out is that Amelia did successfully cross the Atlantic Ocean as a pilot in 1932. And this solo transatlantic flight was the most famous of her flying accomplishments. It earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross Award from Congress and the National Geographic Gold Medal Award as well. So as Amelia gained fame for her flying achievements, these records that she set and other flights as well, she found different platforms to help finance her flying and promote aviation. She was offered a position as the aviation editor at Cosmopolitan magazine, where she wrote articles convincing the public to embrace commercial air travel and encouraging people to enter the aviation field. So I want to share with you an excerpt from this Cosmopolitan article that she wrote titled, "Your Next Garage May House an Autogyro." So Amelia sought to normalize flight for the public. It was not a big thing for the public to fly in airplanes at this time. And so this article was one way she went about doing that. So in this article, she said, "It's possible that autogyros will be rubbing shoulders with automobiles in our garage hangars of tomorrow. At least it is no fantastic prediction to foresee the time when perfected autogyros will be as commonplace about country estates as touring cars and motorboats. And if the gyros fulfill the promise of their present experimental state, actually backyards, generous ones, and ample roofs may come to be used as landing fields." So this article was published in 1931, not long after Amelia began flying her Beech-Nut sponsored autogyro, which we'll hear more about in a minute. I've included a couple graphics here. One of them looks like it did not translate very well into the PowerPoint. I apologize about that. This is to show you what autogyros look like. These are some graphics that will be in our museum, and I am a historian, not an engineer, so I won't pretend to be able to explain the differences in propulsion and lift and all of that. But this gives you a good sense of the difference between an autogyro and a helicopter visually. Autogyros were invented in 1923, and their technology later contributed to the development of the helicopter. So autogyros came first. And helicopters ended up becoming a lot more popular after World War II. But in Amelia's time, autogyros were an exciting new technology. Amelia was the first woman to fly an autogyro and to fly an autogyro across the United States. And both of these happened in 1931. So at this point, Mary, I'll hand it back to you to talk a little bit about Beech-Nut and all of that good stuff and show us what you have in your collection.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. I love these graphics. I'm going to have to use those. I'm going to talk to some kids later in the week about this, so I'm excited. Awesome. Let me go back to sharing my screen. I don't think I shut it down. Oh, Zoom. There we go. All right. So just a little bit, because I know you may not be familiar with us. Maybe you're coming from being a visitor or a knowledgeable person about Allison's museum. So a little bit about us. We are the Arkell Museum. We are a fine art museum, and we are also a public library. So that's the front of the building there. It says Arkell. Someone forgot to put museum up there when they designed the building. It would have been nice had they stuck up. The lower building is the original reading room, original library building that was built here in about 1924, and it was a gift to the community by a man named Bartlett Arkell. He founded the Beech Nut Packing Company. You might remember Beech Nut from feeding your kids Beech Nut baby food. Maybe if you reach back more in that memory, if you're one of our elders, you may remember having chewing gum called Beechies. Maybe you had soup, maybe you had their coffee. They tried everything and anything once. And we are located right across the street from the original factory. This is what the factory looked like. These are artist renderings, of course, but the one on the left, I'm not sure about the date, but the upper right, we're thinking is about 1916. So close to when Amelia would have been around the area. And the lower one is, of course, later. And so that's kind of what the Beech Nut factories would have looked like here in Canajoharie. They also had factories in Buffalo, San Jose, and other places around the country. So they were a company founded in the early 1900s, and they expanded quickly and were very into advertising, and really built up their products by advertising them widely. And that is where we get to Amelia in a second. One of the things that Beech Nut became famous for, and what is often recognized, is their gum. They had all sorts of gum. Early on, they hired a gentleman whose name was Babur. I always say it wrong. And he had connections to the Chiclets company, and he actually developed the first Chiclets. So that's that little tiny gum you remember getting. And he brought gum production to Beech Nut, and kind of that was history. They made Beechies, which you can see here. This is an advertisement for that. They made all sorts of interesting kind of gum. Chlorophyll gum, not really sure what that is, but cool. Peppermint, dentifrice, I love it. They had a little bit of everything. So yeah, the gum was one of their main things, and they marketed the gum widely. There's a couple examples here. In the late 1920s, in 29 and 30, there was a big push to sell gum through these, the picture in the center of the two women dressed in kind of like they're in a band, and they are in their drums, they have samples of Beech Nut chewing gum. So these women would travel around the country with a driver and a handler, and would stop in different places across the country and hand out samples. So they were sample girls. Also at the time, Beech Nut is selling to broad audiences. They're selling gum to using different languages, different ethnicities. They're really trying to get everyone chewing their gum. And one of the ways they do this is with these campaigns with these women traveling. They make a small mechanical circus. They're big in the 1929-30 World Fair in New York City. So Beech Nut is really promoting this gum. And then they learn about Amelia Earhart. And they learn about her at some point. And when they do, they realize that she's kind of a big deal. She comes on the scene and really sparks a big flame in aviation, in women's activities, and they see something great in her. They find out that she has set her husband and the marketing team for Pitcairn, which is the airplane manufacturer that manufactured the autogyro. She did an altitude test for them, and held the record for that. And that publicity went really well. Her husband ordered her own autogyro, and Beech Nut called her and said, "Put your order on hold. You don't need it. You can fly ours. We bought one. It's going to be here soon." It was number 13, which apparently she didn't like. So she actually got a different one in the line that was a more lucky number. But they said, as long as you fly it for us, we're going to do an ad campaign. You fly for us, it's going to say Beech Nut on the side, and we will sponsor your transcontinental flight from Newark, California. All you have to do is stop every once in a while and hand out gum. And it has to say Beech Nut on the side. And she, of course, went for this because Amelia Earhart was a woman who worked, and we need to think about her that way, because if you're working as a woman in 1930, 1931, you're trying to make money any way you can, and she's trying to keep flying here, and that's a lot for a woman to take on. So, you know, she's going to grab at what she can, and this advertising opportunity comes around, and, you know, Beech Nut says this is going to be great. She climbs on board. And this is her. I'm not exactly sure where this picture was taken. And I also have looked up who these guys are, and I was trying to match the faces with the executives that we know. I'm assuming they're all Beech Nut executives. Maybe one is her husband. I'm not really sure. But there she is, looking fabulous in the cockpit of the Beech Nut Pitcairn Autogiro. So here's two more publicity shots. I love I'm a clothing history person, so I really love her flight jacket, and then that she takes the picture with it off, which is great for my perspective of, ooh, what was she wearing? What's fun about this is we've tried to guess at the color of the vehicle. What I've recently read said that it was supposed to be red with a tan where the name would be Pan. Hers got painted green. I don't know why, but so I think it was green, and then the Beech Nut was written across the tan section there. And I'm not sure what color the Beech Nut was, but I would think red, just because that was the Beech Nut thing. So those are two great pictures of her. And you can see that the Autogiro is really different from an airplane. It has these big propellers that come down over her head when it's landed. They slant downwards. And her flight, a transcontinental flight, was a publicity stunt. And so as she landed at these designated places, she would sit down and she had a load of Beech Nut gum, and she would hand out Beech Nut samples. People could take a look at the Autogiro. She would answer questions. Maybe she would have a statement. It was kind of a publicity event if she went. And of course, why gum? Well, gum makes sense. We still chew gum to regulate the pressure on our ears when we fly. And it's that same idea. Gum that Beech Nut makes, Amelia Earhart flies, match made in heaven for advertising. And that's what Beech Nut was really all about. This is a really great gift that came as a collection in 2015, which kind of spurred our little obsession with Amelia here in town. And this is a souvenir pin from 1931. Love when the date is right on the object. And it is of a yellow Autogiro with green wings, green landing gear, Beech Nut gum, which the real one didn't say gum, but that's okay. And it's just a really great pin. I always thought that the vehicle must have been yellow because it is in the pin. Of course, why would they do it the different color? I have no idea why they did, but they did. So the color's wrong. But it's a great little pin and a wonderful little addition to the collection. And then, there we go. We have this great studio portrait of Amelia Earhart, and it is dedicated to Bartlett Arkell, who founded the museum and ran Beech Nut for 50 years. She looks fabulous. She's got some sort of flight suit, jumpsuit on. She was very photogenic, which was, I don't want to use the word exploited, but was something that served well while they were building her image and using her in advertising to promote her work and to, of course, make money. To see a closer look, it says for Mr. Bartlett Arkell, I don't know what the next line says without looking at it closer, but it is signed Amelia Earhart. And on the other side of the image is the location, which I tried to look this up and couldn't really find a Pinochet, New York. There is a region in Pennsylvania called that, so that might have been where she was getting that. But regardless, it's listed to Bartlett Arkell and signed by her, so it's pretty cool that it's part of the collection. And then we have this last piece is a piece of mail that Amelia Earhart took on her flight from Honolulu to California, which Allison mentioned earlier, in 1935. And it's actually signed again by Amelia Earhart, dated the date she landed in Oakland. And it's to Clark Arkell, who was a son of Bartlett Arkell and who was part of the Beech Nut Company. So kind of cool that we have that piece as well. But as you can see, all of these little pieces don't tell a full story. It's just a little blip in her world, in her time working to make money, to be able to do what she loved, which was fly. And she's definitely an inspiration for keeping going and really doing what you can to make your dreams or what you want to do come true. So I'll give it back to you, Allison. Let me stop sharing. And you can start again.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I have seen so many pictures of her with her beech nut. And yeah, I never knew a lot of those details. So that was really cool to learn more of the history behind that. Let me get my PowerPoint back up here. Alrighty. So for the other portion of my presentation, I'd like to focus less on Amelia's flying and more on what she accomplished for women while her feet were on the ground. So in August of 1929, Amelia participated in the Women's Air Derby. This was the first official women-only air race in the US. And after the Derby, a lot of the women pilots who participated agreed that they should form some sort of organization to help support female pilots. So they invited all 117 licensed female pilots that existed at the time to a meeting that November. And then in November of 1929, they met and officially founded an organization for mutual support and advancement of female pilots. They threw about several different name ideas for this organization, and Amelia ultimately suggested that maybe they should take their name from the number of original charter members. So there were 99 original members, so they called themselves the 99s. And Amelia was elected the first president of this organization in 1931. And this is a really lasting piece of Amelia's legacy and the legacy of these other pilots. This organization is still around today, and they now have members in over 40 countries. So it's really grown since it was first created. Outside of the world of aviation, Amelia had a busy personal life as well. We'll talk a little bit about her marriage. Amelia married George Putnam, that publisher I mentioned earlier, who helped set up her first transatlantic flight. Amelia supposedly rejected multiple proposals from George before marrying him in February of 1931. So I have here an excerpt from a letter that Amelia gave to George on the morning of their wedding. It says, "You must know again my reluctance to marry, my feeling that I shatter thereby chances in work, which means most to me. I feel the move just now as foolish as anything I could do. On our life together, I want you to understand that I shall not hold you to any medieval code of faithfulness to me, nor shall I consider myself bound to you similarly. I must exact a cruel promise, and that is that you will let me go in a year if we find no happiness together." So not really the most romantic thing to read on your wedding day, but this letter is a really good example of how Amelia did not really conform to the societal expectations for women of the time. She didn't want marriage to mean for her what it meant for a lot of women, which was confinement, staying at home, taking care of the house. She wanted to continue doing what she was doing, even if she got married. And unlike a lot of married women at the time, Amelia continued to use her maiden name. You don't often hear her now called Amelia Putnam. And at the time, when people would refer to her as Mrs. Putnam or Amelia Putnam in journalism, she would actually write and correct them and say, "Please refer to me by Amelia Earhart." So despite Amelia's initial misgivings about marriage, she and George worked really well together, and she did agree to marry him for a reason. They did like each other. And she later described their marriage, saying, "Ours is a reasonable and contented partnership. My husband with his solo jobs and I with mine. But the system of dual control works satisfactorily, and our work and our play is a great deal together." So they really did get along quite well, and they had a very loving marriage. George was fully supportive of Amelia, and he did a lot of work on her behalf, securing sponsorships that helped to finance her flights, including Beech-Nut. And his company also published the books that Amelia wrote throughout her life. So Amelia's views on marriage were pretty radical for the time, and that coupled with her support for and advocacy for women led a lot of people to see her as a feminist. But once when she was asked if she was a feminist, she said, "I cannot claim to be a feminist, but do rather enjoy seeing women tackling all kinds of new problems, new for them, that is." So although this is what she said, Amelia used her platform as a famous pilot to really shape and mold discussions about women and about women's rights in the United States during her life. So Amelia was a very fierce champion of women's rights. She advocated for the equality of women within aviation and outside the world of aviation. She was a member of the National Women's Party, which was a political organization that was formed in 1916 to fight for women's suffrage. And as a part of this organization, she was an advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment, which states, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." And in 1932, Amelia met with President Hoover, who she's pictured with here, to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment. And this quote here is from that meeting. She said, "I know from practical experience of the discriminations which confront women when they enter an occupation where men have priority in opportunity, advancement, and protection." She also shared with him that in aviation, the Department of Commerce did not recognize any legal difference between men and women who were licensed to fly. And she wanted to see that sort of equality in all sorts of fields throughout the United States. This was a major theme in lectures that Amelia gave as well. So as part of helping Amelia build up her image, earn money to fly, George booked lectures for Amelia all across the country. And in her lectures, she would talk about her flying adventures. She would encourage women to join the field of aviation, and she would talk about women's equality as well. For audiences that included men and women, she tended to focus a lot more on promoting commercial flight, sharing her experiences in flying. But with women's group, she shared a lot more of her views on the rights and responsibilities of women, encouraging them to try things that men had been able to do for decades, like aviation. She once said this quote here, "I hope women keep on trying to enter aviation. In doing so, they must overcome what they have had to in any business and do twice as well as men to get half the credit." So she really wanted women to work so that they could reach an equal ground with men and for society to see men and women as equals. She would always proudly proclaim that women were every bit as capable as men, both in the cockpit of an airplane and outside of it. And she really urged women to be more independent and pursue careers outside of the home. And always her biggest priority was trying to get women to enter the field of aviation. So encouraging women to have their own careers became one of Amelia's main focuses as her life progressed. In 1935, she was offered a position at Purdue University as a counselor for careers for women. At this time, a lot of women who attended college eventually ended up just remaining home once they got married. And as we know, Amelia was a proponent for a much more independent marriage, having a career in addition to having your marriage. And she encouraged this for the female students that she worked with as well. She wanted her students to feel confident in pursuing a career before they got married. We have this quote from her here that says, "When you graduate, be sure you go on and have a career. Don't get married as soon as you get out of school." And supposedly, some of the male students at Purdue were not really happy that Amelia was saying all of these things to the female students. They said finding someone to marry is hard enough. So supposedly she was doing a good job getting these women to go out and get jobs from college. Amelia's husband, George, later wrote the second quote that I have here, saying that Amelia's time at Purdue was one of the most satisfying adventures of her life. She really loved being able to help these women and make an impact on the next generation of female professionals. So Purdue really loved Amelia as well. The university funded the purchase and modifications of Amelia's Lockheed Electra 10E, which is pictured here on the slide, with some of the students that she worked with. So this plane is the one that ours at the museum Muriel is identical to. Amelia's Electra was purchased for her around the world flight attempt. And although there were some men who had circumnavigated the world in airplanes before, these flights all took place in the Northern Hemisphere. Amelia was the first one to attempt this around the world flight along the equator. So this created a much longer and riskier flight path, but also a much more satisfying reward when she would complete it. As we know, she did not. She disappeared on that flight with that plane. But had Amelia returned, she did intend for this big around the world flight to be her final flight. She saw this as one final adventure to embark on before returning to her important work at Purdue. And she really wanted to come back and focus a lot more on working with these students, encouraging these young women to pursue their dreams in the same way that she did. So I'll leave you with one final quote from Amelia. This is from a letter that she wrote to George before that final flight. She said, "Please know I am quite aware of the hazards of the trip. I want to do it because I want to do it. Women must try to do things as men have tried. When they fail, their achievements must be but a challenge to others." So even though she did disappear on that final flight around the world, Amelia did not leave behind a tragic legacy. Her story is an inspiring one, and it challenges others to pursue their dreams and fight for what they believe in, kind of like what Mary was saying earlier. Amelia chased after her own dreams of flying, and she flew to the top of her field in aviation. And on the ground, she was always promoting women's rights for pilots, for students, and beyond. And so she really leaves behind a great legacy for us to be inspired by. And that's all I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. That was great. We have a couple of questions. If you have questions, please jump in, but I will look through now. A comment that there are several 99s attending this presentation. That is super cool. Hello and welcome. That's really great. And you're very welcome, Claire, for the info on Beech Nut. Yes, many folk have lived and breathed Beech Nut for many years and don't know about this little part of advertising that was dreamed up with her in mind. Will any part of, this is for you, Allison, will any part of the museum be open during the Amelia Earhart Festival this July?
Good question. Yeah, so we have in Atchison a festival every July near Amelia's birthday where we celebrate Amelia, have an air show over the river. It's a lot of fun. We will be open this year. The museum will. It'll be kind of more behind the scenes because we'll still be under construction at that point. But we will be inviting people in to see our progress. So you get a little sneak peek before we open next year.
I know from there are people on this call that are museum professionals, and there is not a new museum born every day. So a couple of sentences about what it's like to be really on the ground of floor of doing this. This is really interesting.
Yeah, so this is really cool. When I entered the museum field, I did not ever think I would be able to be on the ground floor of a new museum. So it's been very, very exciting. We are working with an exhibit design company called Dimensional Innovations based out of Kansas City, and they are helping us create a lot of the exhibits for our museum, like that roller coaster one you saw. And it's just been so cool to see the whole process, you know, how like work that goes into designing exhibits and all of the research that goes into it, and even like a video that you would have in a museum, like an exit video saying, oh, wrapping up the experience, how much work goes into creating storyboards and scripts and all of these things and finding someone to read it. And it's awesome to see how much work goes into the back end of it. And then for me personally, it's been really cool because we've had, even though we're not officially open yet, we've invited people to come into our space and see the airplane, see the designs for the exhibits. And it's really not often that the public gets to come in and see a museum that's not complete yet. So that's been really cool to share that with people and see how much interest there is in seeing a museum in progress. That's been really fun as well.
Yeah. As a museum nerd, I'm always interested in that, but that is really fun. I know something we do here is once there's art up on the wall, we open the gallery, even if we don't have all of our labels up yet, because we want people to see that it's a process and it takes time, and that we can only do so much. And it's fun to get that perspective, what people think about it before it's done. So that's really exciting. I would have loved to come and explore before it was done, but I can't wait to come after. Now I have a reason to go. So are you located in the same place as the Birthplace Museum as well?
Good question. So we are in the same town as the Birthplace. We're both in Atchison, but we're kind of on opposite sides of town from each other. So the Birthplace is actually overlooking the Missouri River, really beautiful spot. And then we are located at Atchison's airport. So it's about a 10-minute drive away. So it's cool that we're at an airport and we have an airplane as our main artifact, because we sometimes have pilots fly in who want to see the airplane and they can just fly right to the museum, which is fun.
Oh, that's really cool. I know some of my locals from Central New York. I saw on Facebook there's a program to put signs about like mythical stories that have happened around the area in New York, you know, those legends that people tell. And there's a legend from Fly Creek, which is a town near Cooperstown, which is a more famous town here in New York. And in Fly Creek, that someone there met Amelia Earhart reading a book outside the library in Fly Creek, New York. So there's a sign for that now. So I kind of wonder how much wandering she did around here. There's a lot of small airfields, and flying is still part of the culture here in the Mohawk Valley. So one thing I always wonder about is, you know, where did she go? Like, what little places did she hang out in? But apparently, mythically, she was met in front of the library in Fly Creek. So just another little gem that's out there about her. So I think that we'll wrap it up here unless there's any other questions. Definitely follow the Arkell and the Amelia Earhart Hanger Museum on social media. If that's your thing, throw a like, throw a follow, makes a big difference for us. And thank you so much for coming, and looking forward to our next presentation, which I don't know what it'll be on, but it'll be great. So thank you very much for your time, Allison. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Have a great night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.